Hi, Will.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
I'm doing okay. How are you?
I'm.
Did I already ask you how you're doing? Is this like one of those
you
things?
You can ask me again.
Yeah.
You know, like experience is like a constant flux, and so it's no guarantee it's going to be the same.
Recurrence.
Yeah.
So let me introduce you. I'm Robert Wright. This is the Wright Show, available in both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Will Wilkinson, a veritable intellectual giant who resides in Washington. Is it accurate so far?
It's mostly I reside in Iowa, but I work in Washington, and that's where I am.
Reminds me, before we get to the gist of this, there's something that I think too few people know about you. Now, you didn't grow up in Iowa, but the thing that too few people know about you is that did you grow up in Iowa?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so the thing too few people know is that you grew up in a town where your father was the chief of police. Is that correct?
Correct.
Now, what's that like? Do you feel that you have to abide by the rules with complete fidelity, or is it like the opposite, where you feel that you can violate them with impunity?
That's an interesting question. I was a slightly spacey, oblivious kid, and kind of a sweetheart who didn't have much of a drive to do stuff that you weren't really supposed to do. Even though I'm like extremely antinomian by nature, so I developed a very sweet personality, won my parents' trust, could have gotten away with anything, but never actually wanted to do anything that was that bad, other than like sneak out of the house so I could like take photographs at night or something like that. So like it was kind of boring. I didn't realize until I got to college that it was actually possible for a police officer to pull you over for speeding. However, the first semester in college, I got 3 speeding tickets in like a month. I didn't realize that the police officers in Marshalltown, Iowa, weren't pulling me over because I was the chief's son. Oh,
I see. But that's what was happening, really?
Yeah, and my dad, who's like the most kind of upstanding, clean law and order guy.
He would have been appalled if he had known.
He would have been completely appalled. He would have wanted me like punished to the limits of the law.
Right.
But they just didn't want the hassle. So I just like, feedback is important. And I was never getting any negative feedback about driving a little too fast. That's really all it amounted to.
Okay. So anyway, let me continue with the introduction of you. You are at the Niskanen Center, you are the vice president for research or something?
That's it.
And one thing you did, we're going to talk about a number of things. One is you've got a theory about what it is about America that leads to the election of somebody like Donald Trump, and what to do about it, since you, like me, are not a big fan of Trump. But also the Niskanen Center just put out a report that you were one of 4 co-authors on. I'm trying to put my hands on it. It's here somewhere. Oh, here it is. They got a fair amount of attention.
Yeah.
David Brooks was smitten. He just wrote a whole column about how wonderful it was. It's called The Center Can Hold, Public Policy for an Age of Extremes. And so maybe you can talk about that a little. But I wanted to start out just talking a little bit about presidential candidates and which ones you like. Maybe that's like a way of backing into the substance of this report. Once you tell us which candidates you like, we'll be able to guess what kind of policies this report you co-authored favors.
Well, that's going to be kind of tricky because, like, the report is trying to create a
right. It's not a bullet point. It's not a bullet point policy proposal report.
Yeah, but the emphasis is on trying to craft a governing philosophy for the center right. Now, the center right and the center left are really, the same thing from a different perspective in a way. And we work primarily in our political work on Capitol Hill with moderate Republicans. So that's where we're trying to exert most of our influence. But since the advent of Trump, I've not been very enamored of the behavior of the Republican Party, and voted a straight Democratic ticket in the last election because I just want to punish them.
Well, you even didn't you support Obama? And let me give a little more background. I when I originally met you, I think you were at Cato and identified as a libertarian. Now, already at that point, I guess Brink Lindsay was starting to use this word libertarian to refer to people who are libertarian, but in a less extreme way than you might have thought of a libertarian being 10 or 20 years before that. But I think you voted for Obama. Didn't you support over Bush or over McCain or over somebody?
I voted for Obama against McCain.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I was vehemently opposed to the invasion and occupation of Iraq. And that was, I think, the dominant issue. But like a lot of people, I was a little bit smitten with Obama and was excited about kind of having an African-American president. Like that seemed significant and important to me, and important in a cultural way that was more important than the kind of, narcissism of small differences between the Republican and Democratic parties at the time. But I voted against Obama in the second election. I voted for Mitt Romney. Now this is partly just identity politics. I grew up a sort of minority sect Mormon, and so like a lot of people, I just wanted to see some representation in government. And I was like, and I think highly of Mitt Romney as a competent administrator of large bureaucratic organizations.
Well, who knows? You may have a chance to vote for him again. The night is young. And he's ageless. He looks darn good for a man his age. You know,
it looks terrific.
Yeah, looks terrific. So anyway, with that as backdrop, are there any candidates? I mean, on either side, I guess. If you want to imagine an insurgent candidate on the Republican Party, you can, or you can tell us which Democrats, if any, you meet with your approval.
Well, at the we had a big conference in December on after Trump, the future of the center right, and our kickoff speaker was Larry Hogan, the Republican governor of Maryland, and at that event, I think made a little headway in pushing him towards exploring a primary challenge, and so we've been trying to give Larry Hogan a nudge. But that's part of our,
You just raised his visibility because I had never heard of him. So you're doing your work very effectively.
There you go. He is the second most popular governor in the United States of America. And it's an interesting thing that the most popular governors are, moderate Republicans in very liberal states. So I have a theory of that, but.
Well, we'll get to your grand theory in due time. Are there any Democrats who have either thrown their hats in the ring or everyone is sure are going to who you like?
Well, so far my favorite is Elizabeth Warren. She cares a lot about a lot of the things that I care about, and as somebody who's in DC a lot and gets to interface with congressional offices, I've been more impressed by just her policy people and organization, the depth of thought that goes into public policy. Because mostly it's just vapid, and many offices just don't have. They're sort of incurious, or they're just like towing the party line. And Warren's office deeply does their homework. They draw on the best academic literature and put together really serious legislative proposals that are sort of well crafted, kind of ready to go. And she pays attention to a lot of things that I think don't get enough attention. And because she is so detail oriented and draws so heavily on, actual high quality, thinkers in crafting her legislation, it's good stuff. So I've, at Niskanen, we've worked with them on.
Now that's surprising because she's so far to the left, and Niskanen, I mean, as you said, is kind of more or less center right or centrist at best. So, there's
a lot of things that shouldn't have a partisan valence that do, right? So one of the things that I'm extremely concerned about, which isn't a partisan issue, is just like corruption. Like I've become like a very Teddy Roosevelt-y or something like that. I just really want to root out graft. Mm-hmm. And I really, really like markets. I like capitalism, but it's just absolutely choked with, grifters and scammers and rent seekers and regulatory capture.
Not all of which is illegal, but you still don't like it, right?
I still don't like it. That doesn't, corruption doesn't have to be, right. Illegal to be corrupt.
Okay.
And, you see how DC works, there's a lot of, technically legal pay for play, that is, that is, completely in defiance with the spirit of mm-hmm. Republican legislation, mm-hmm. Small R Republican, and I agree with her emphasis on a lot of those issues. One thing I like about her is that she actually sounds very similar in a lot of ways to stuff that we put out from Niskanen. My colleagues Brink Lindsay and Steve Tellis have this terrific book, The Captured Economy, mm-hmm. Which is largely about rent seeking and regulatory capture, and how.
Maybe we should tell people that rent seeking as a technical term means, well, give us examples. It's like getting, using a position of like power, or, like monopolists can seek rents, right? Is that right?
A monopolist would be like the paragon of a rent seeker. In economic terms, a rent is basically just the profit that you have from the exclusive use of something. But the bad kind of rent seeking has to do with anti-competitive practices, where you're trying to exclude others from the market in order to dominate more market shares. So if I am a company and, I have a production process that's a little different than your production process, and, we create one emission and you create another emission. If I get a law passed that heavily regulates the emission that comes from your, then what I'm doing is just putting you at a competitive advantage so that I get more of the proceeds from,
right.
Whatever that industry, and that's called rent seeking, because I'm seeking to dominate the economic rent.
So using leverage to direct more revenue toward yourself than the market operating purely would direct to you.
Yeah, and so and a lot of rent seeking is perfectly legal. So one of the most sort of monopolistic practices in our economy is just is patents and copyrights, right? So you have you're a writer, you've got a lot of intellectual property, you've got these copyrights that you I forget how they're going to be owned by your estate long after you're dead. But the profits in technical terms that you get from your exclusive ownership rights to Nonzero or any of your amazing books, those are, in economic terms, rents. But trying to do whatever you can to make sure that nobody else can ever internalize those benefits is, rent seeking. So when Disney keeps extending the copyright on Mickey Mouse so that it never goes into the public domain so that they can keep profiting off of it. That's kind of rent seeking. But like patents that make, like nobody really gets rich off of writing books, unfortunately.
People have. It's just that usually they're not actual writers.
Yeah. I mean, what's the Harry Potter lady? She's
an actual writer. I'll give her credit. She's a
lovely writer. J.K. Rowling. I've been reading it to my son, and she's just like a lovely prose writer and a great storyteller. So I got no bones with J.K. Rowling, but like patents and if you have your phone, my understanding is that. And this is a Samsung phone with an Android operating system. But
is that the S9 there, or is that the Note? Oh, never
this is the S9. This is the S9.
Sharp.
No, it's not an S8 Note. Like a bunch of the patents for touchscreen interfaces on like smartphones, and for some of the operating system moves, like Microsoft has a lock on a bunch of those patents. So
they had a lock on the file format. What was it? The FAT something file format forever.
So those kinds of things. So those kinds of things.
You're against all of this. You're not any kind of. You're not a caricature of a libertarian. I don't even know if you still call yourself a libertarian, but you're certainly not a caricature of one in any event.
No, because I want the fundamental rules that structure markets to actually be efficient, to actually be positive sum games, and not sort of like negative sum competitions for the internalization of anti-competitive rents.
Okay, so Elizabeth Warren, you like, surprising as all.
She's good at that stuff. She's got the right kind of focus. Lindsay likes to say that, I forget which way he puts it, but we're singing the same tune, but she's got different words or something like that.
Yeah.
And so I don't agree with everything that she proposes. I just wrote a op-ed for the Times that hopefully will materialize in a day or so that is pretty deeply critical of the wealth tax. But her overall emphasis on electoral reform, clean government, anti-corruption, sort of like limiting self-dealing capitalism, but understanding that efficient markets are actually what makes people wealthy and better off. I like that. I think she's better about that than most of the field. And I think it's like she's kind of smarter. She's more of a academic in a way than most of the field.
Any other candidates that captured your fancy?
Well, a big issue for me is like criminal justice reform, and so I'm actually like really worried of. A lot of people don't understand that the correct explanation of America's just massive level of incarceration is not sentencing guidelines, not like private prisons, not like the war on drugs. It's just prosecutorial discretion. It's just what prosecutors or what district attorneys at the local level decide to charge, and how they decide to, what sentences that they seek. And there was, this huge trend.
But do you think they are racist or what? How is that turning into a disparity in sentencing between whites?
I don't think I'm 100% certain that there are many racist district attorneys, but the about a half of all of the prisoners come from, forget what it was. I wrote a piece about this for The Economist when I was there. But it's basically about half of the prisoners in our system come from the 10 most populous counties in the United States. Those are almost all Democratic places. Often have prosecutors who aren't white, and so it's not obvious that racism is driving the largest part of the problem. What it is just like political incentives. Is that there is this incredibly widespread perception that you will not get reelected as a DA unless you're seen as maximally tough on crime. That's what's rewarded electorally. And if you go soft on anybody, if you give somebody a shorter sentence than you could have and they get out of jail and then they go like rape a grandma somewhere, then your political career is over. So all the incentives point towards just locking everybody up for the maximum sentence every time, plea bargaining constantly for the highest sentence that you can get. Most people never go to trial, so it's just people are accepting pleas, but the plea deals they're offered are awful. And because it is just the discretion of prosecutors driving mass incarceration, and because they're driven to that by the political incentive of reelection, I get really worried about a tough on crime big city prosecutor getting elected.
Are you talking about Kamala Harris?
No, I'm talking about Kamala Harris. This is why I worry about her because like this is the point at which like the effort to draw down mass incarceration is kind of getting towards a tipping point, and there are a bunch of major municipalities where they've recently thrown out the hawkish prosecutor and elected a more dovish DA. That's the beginning of a sea change that is the most promising thing that's happening on this issue in a long time. I worry that like electing a hawk, the president of the United States, will send the message that actually this is what pays off politically.
Of course, her incentive structure is different now. I mean, she's not, she's running for president on the Democratic side. In fact, I would think she's going to start saying things pretty soon that have the effect of distancing her from some of her past in this regard. But
she hasn't so far.
She has not so far.
No, and if it kind of feels like she's embracing it, and that worries me, because especially if she embraces it, defends it, runs on it. Because the thing is, I think it is politically good for her in the general. It's maybe a push in the Democratic primary, but I would like to see people criticize that and try and exact the toll, or get them worried enough that she does have to distance herself from it, because even that message is useful.
My
I think
problem,
being in prison is bad.
What's that? Say that again.
I think people being in prison longer than they deserve to be is basically like just like locking somebody in your basement for no reason, and it's just like one of the most horrible things you can do to a human being.
Yeah, and I mean, you do have the problem that just, low-income people tend not to have the best lawyers, and that I assume that accounts for a certain amount of what we're talking about here.
They don't have any lawyers. I mean,
right.
That's another big problem in the system.
Public defenders, who I'm sure are kind of overtaxed in terms of the demands on their time. Some of them are good. They're all well-intentioned, I suspect, pretty much. But many of them are just absolutely outstanding, but they get a stack every freaking day. They can spend like 2 minutes on every case. They've never met the person before. They have to like page through the thing, and they're like, okay, like what are we going to do? And they like I mean, I really do think we're just systematically violating a constitutional guarantee in terms of providing people with a lawyer. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think we kind of
meandering, but
What's that?
I said this seems like I'm meandering, but
no, actually, I think for a second there, you seemed to be meandering toward where I wanted to take you anyway, which was your grand theory of how we wind up with presidents like Trump, which is puts a lot of emphasis on population density, and it's kind of a subtle argument. I mean, people have heard a version of it. They've heard that low density states are overrepresented certainly in the Senate, and that they get a little of an edge in the Electoral College or something. But you're making a more kind of subtle and textured argument, right, about the role that population density is playing and why it's playing it.
Yeah, I'm making an argument about urbanization.
And by the way, we should say there is a New York Times piece you wrote about this that we will link to. I know you're also working on a larger scale version of it, but there's an
I'm working on a big paper on how, basically the sorting dynamic of long-term urbanization segregates the population along basically the psychological lines that predict left-right sympathies. And that division ends up sort of being amplified by the long-term economic trends that drive urbanization in the first place. That's super abstract, so I could explain it a little more.
Let me start with one thing I noticed in that piece that I hadn't quite occurred to me, is that just the distinction between urban areas and much lower density areas is a more clear-cut partisan divide than it has been in decades past, right? And it's more and more the case that you just look at the growth in population density. If you want to predict how people voted, population density is a stronger predictor than it used to be.
Yeah, it's like, and it's truly astonishing, right? This is actually what got me into this. So there's a political scientist at Stanford named Jonathan Rodden, who's the sort of expert on this, who has been collecting, who's been sort of assembling a database of vote share at the precinct level, and tying those to precinct level population densities. So he's now got very granular, the most granular data that you can get on the correlation between density and partisan vote share. And it's a crazy, basically linear relationship. If you just find the historic center of it, any town in America, and you find the dense, that's usually going to be the densest part, right? Like especially if it's more to the east, and wasn't just built for automotive sprawl. Like, just find town hall. You're going to be in the densest part of town. That's going to be the most democratic part of town. And as you just point yourself toward the country, and as population density drops, Democratic vote share slowly drops. You get to a density that is about 50-50 Republican Democrat, on average around, between 900 to 1,100 people per square mile. And then as you just keep going less and less dense, it just gets more and more and more Republican. Mm-hmm. And I'm just like, that is a freaking crazy pattern. Like, so the sparsest places are the most Republican, and the densest places are the most Democratic. And it's just like a continuous shift.
And why did it not used to be like that, whereas it is like that now? Does this have to do with the coalitions that now constitute the parties, or with actual demographic shifts, or both?
A little bit of both. So the thing that really complicated it, the real deep story is how white people have sorted, right? Like, that's the thing that mostly explains it, because the population share in the less dense Republican side of what I call the density divide, right? That's an almost entirely white population. Like, there are many local exceptions. There are lots of rural African Americans in lots of places in the South. There are lots of rural, Hispanic populations around the Southwest. But just taking the population as a whole, that low density population is almost entirely white. And so part of the question is, how do they end up mostly entirely white? And so there's a bunch of things that go into it. The African American population, not that long ago was way more rural than it was. The sort of the Great Migration was a huge, urbanized most of America's African American population. That was a longer time ago, but that trend continued for a long, long time. And then just the realignment of the parties after 1965,
Civil Rights Act,
is a big part of the story too. That because the Republican and Democratic white constituencies were all kind of before that kind of scattered around relatively randomly. There wasn't really a party for urban whites versus a party for rural whites, but now there is. And so, but the longer term argument that I make is just that people have overlooked that anything like urbanization is a general trend, and this is like the biggest thing that has happened in the world, for the past 200 years, is the migration of the human population from rural regions to large cities, right? Mm-hmm. And any movement like that is going to have some kind of selective effect. There's going to be some differences in what kinds in responsiveness to whatever the incentives to urbanize are, right? And there have to be some, or else people wouldn't do it, right? Whatever those incentives are, there are going to be people who are more and less responsive to those, right? And so over time, as urbanization continues, the people most responsive to those incentives go first, and you start, wave after wave. And after urbanization gets, a long ways along, the only people left who haven't urbanized are the people least responsive to the incentives to urbanize.
And what are the incentives? I would think are partly economic and maybe partly cultural. Well, why don't you? The other question is, how would you other way to put the question is, how would you characterize the kinds of people who are left in the rural areas?
The people who are left in rural areas are, as I was saying before, almost entirely white.
Right, but they're not randomly selected whites, is what you're saying when you say they're the ones who don't respond.
They're not at all randomly selected. So they're like they represent many generations of self-selection out of rural areas, because there's there's net negative migration to those areas, right? Like, so nobody's people do move there, but like on net, it's massively negative. So almost all the people who are there are people who are already there and stayed. And so in some ways you can see it, the big distinction is the distinction between, leavers and stayers, right? But the first big incentive to urbanize is just ethnic. So if you're not white, it's very likely that you urbanize, and there are clear reasons for that. It's like safety in numbers is the biggest reason, I think. So immigrant communities, African American communities, Hispanic American communities, like they all tend to cluster in cities because they want to live. They don't want to be dominated by the majority in rural areas, so that there's a kind of solidaristic clustering that you get that's just based on ethnicity.
Now, it seems to me, one, I don't know if you consider it a rival hypothesis or you embrace it as well, but it could be the case that it isn't so much the kinds of people who go to the city as what the city does to people once they're there. First of all, one of the big incentives to go there is economic. So you wind up having more money than the cousins you left behind. And another thing is you are in a more multicultural, multi-ethnic milieu where there's a more cosmopolitan ethos that prevails. You're on the subway with people from a billion different ethnicities every day and so on. So I would think it's kind of hard to sort out those two effects. So in other words, what kinds of people go to the city, but then also what does the city do to the people who go there?
Absolutely. So there's, and just a billion things. You have to decide whether something's a selection effect or whether it's a treatment effect, or they, in most of the political science, sociology literature, they call it a contact effect. I've just become super duper convinced of the dominance of selection effects. And one of the reasons why is because of the starkness of this pattern. Right? So what are the measurements? What are the numbers that reflect the starkness of the pattern? But like the continuous shift from more dense, more blue, less dense.
Oh, I see. You mean the sheer partisan?
That sorting, right, suggests that there is an underlying basis to the sorting, and so there is a very large literature in moral psychology and political psychology that sort of correlates ideological disposition to basic personality traits. So the dominant theory in personality psychology is the 5-factor theory,
right? And
2 of those relate relatively strongly to basically attitudes towards social issues. Right? It doesn't mean anything in terms of like what you think of as left-right economic issues, but social issues.
So these are like what? Openness is one of the dimensions. Is that right?
The main one is openness to experience, and then the other one, a little bit weaker, is conscientiousness. So higher conscientiousness is positively correlated with conservatism and social views. Mm-hmm. High openness is very strongly correlated with liberalism in social issues, and so low openness is very highly correlated with conservative views and social issues. Now, when you're thinking about the populist stuff, the most interesting aspect of that is that low openness correlates very strongly. In some ways, probably is just a manifestation of these other measures that like predict your attitudes towards immigration, or predict your sense of in-group, out-group solidarity. Right.
Although these days, I got to say, I see a lot of that on both sides. I mean, that's, of course, a variable that can change with, a degree of tribalism, you might call it, can change according to circumstances. And
well, the thing is, like, human nature is
malleable,
way more the same than it is different. Right. Like, so to say that one group of people is more sort of in-group, out-group, coalition oriented isn't to say that the other group isn't. It's just like that's just an incredibly massively strong human impulse. So it's just a little stronger and a little weaker, but it makes a big difference in terms of how things
on an issue like immigration. You think it makes a difference?
Yeah. So there are a number of different measures that political scientists use. So there's a measure that's just called ethnocentrism that comes from Donald Kinder and Cindy Kam. He's a Michigan, she's at Vanderbilt. And ethnocentrism is a measure, and the thing is, like, I hate talking about, it's always complicated talking about this stuff because like every single term always has a very sort of technical meaning that is slightly different from the vernacular meaning. So it can be confusing. So this sense of ethnocentrism is a measure of in-group favoritism. It's not a measure of out-group hostility, right? So how you calculate it is it's basically 2 different tests. One is just like they call it a feeling thermometer. Right? So if you just ask people on a scale of 1 to 100, like 0 being maximally cool and 100 being maximally hot, how warmly do you feel about this group? Right? And a more ethnocentric person, they just have the difference between how warmly they feel about their group and other groups is larger, right? So now the most ethnocentric group in the United States is African Americans. African Americans like each other a whole lot relative to other groups. And that's something that is predictable.
Of course, it could be they feel freer to express that than whites who feel the same way. That's a possibility, right? When you're talking to some pollster or something.
Yeah. Like then that's something you always have to worry about is, social desirability bias,
right?
They call it. But the explanation for that seems to just be that if you're that systematic oppression tends to bind.
Yeah, sure.
Oppressed people together. So it doesn't mean you don't like other people or other members of ethnic groups, right? So that's important to be clear about. It just means that you're especially fond of your group relative to other groups. And the other measure they use to test it is, you ask people a bunch of poll questions about how hardworking or, lazy or intelligent or X, like this or that group is. And you can see which people think their group is better on these attributes than other groups. So it turns out that highly ethnocentric people, that high ethnocentrism very tightly correlated with low openness, and high ethnocentrism predicts immigration attitudes stronger than any other variable that they can find.
Now, let me interrupt and ask one question. Is there data on personality differences between urban and rural populations along the 5 dimensions of the Big Five, like openness and conscientiousness? Yes.
There's not a lot, but there's a little. It's kind of an emerging field. The kind of leader in this field is a psychologist at Cambridge, I believe. His name is Jason Renfro, and has done a lot of really interesting work on the geography of personality. One of the first books this is actually a funny story. I got really interested in this. This is a little bit of an aside. I don't know, a number of years ago, maybe 2003, I used to do this thing for Cato called Cato Unbound, and we'd commission essays. Mm-hmm. And I forget what the issue was. I'd commissioned an essay from Richard Florida. And, he's like, as a writer, is one of those kind of loves to write a quick draft without thinking too hard about tweaking it, but then gives it to you. And so I cleaned it up a bunch and sent it back to him. I was really nervous because he's famous and stuff like that. And I was like, I hope he doesn't mind that I heavily line edited him. And he was like, this is awesome. And so he hired me to do some work on his book that was called Who's Your City? I think is what it's called. It was about finding the city that matches you.
Did he come up with the term creative class or something like that?
He did. Yeah. Rise of the Creative Class is his book, is big claim to fame. And so in the course of doing some work on that book, I was like, hey, it would be really cool if you could get some work that correlated personality type to where people choose to live. And he's like, that's a cool idea. So we got this guy, Jason Renfro, to do it. And so there's some interesting stuff in that book on which regions of the United States certain personalities predominate more in.
So you launched a major research initiative.
Yeah, and the thing is, I had kind of forgotten about that, and I was getting into this literature. I was like, where can I find stuff on the geographic correlates of the distribution of personalities? And a lot of things were citing that Richard Florida book as a seminal text, and I'm like, wait, this literature is that I'm using is so that anyway. I don't want to give myself too much credit, but it just is amusing. It's sort of like when you try to want to look something up. Mm. I'm sure this has happened to you because you're a writer who writes a ton, and you're like, and you Google something, and the first thing that comes up is an article that you wrote about it. That ever happened to you?
It's happened. More often I'm sitting there smoldering because somebody didn't cite an article. but let me so cut to the chase here. The what are the to the extent that they have studied it, which I grant you, apparently you're saying is a limited extent.
It's exactly what you'd expect from the just if you already knew what the correlates of the personality correlates of partisan ID are.
So urban is more open, more conscientious.
Yeah, and so the denser a place is, the higher the concentration of highly open people. The less dense it is, the higher the concentration of low openness people. And this actually makes a lot of sense too when you're thinking about the chief economic motivations to urbanize, right? So the reason that cities are growing, constitute a larger and larger share of overall economic output, is that they're concentrating highly educated workers, right? And that the complementarities of getting highly skilled people close to each other keep increasing. So they call these agglomeration effects. Mm-hmm. And so the productivity premium and consequently the wage premium of being in a city keeps going up. So if you get a college degree and you want a job that is going to pay you what the college degree wage premium is, the odds keep going up that you're going to have to move a city.
Right.
To get it.
And if you are running a company and placing your headquarters in a place, as we just saw with Jeff Bezos, there's a strong incentive to go where the talent already is, right? And at his level, it's like, no, Pittsburgh doesn't have enough talent. It's like some big cities with major universities, not enough. I want to be in New York and DC. And so you can see how the effect, there's a positive feedback effect, right? The more workers stream to these epicenters of high skill employment, the more the companies want to locate there, and it goes on and on.
Yeah, and that is the force that has led to really pretty radical divergence in the economic performance of different parts of the country. So it's just a handful of very large cities create most of the growth. And basically the rest of the country is a fucking wasteland.
Yeah. Hey, you know what? I'm thinking maybe you should not run for office in certain parts of the country and possibly anywhere now that we have that on video, but go ahead.
I live in Iowa, but the thing is, it's like, and this is a piece that I've been working on on the Times about rural stagnation, about like how the Republican Party doesn't even get that the people who vote for them are in pretty dire economic straits in a lot of places, and they're don't know what to do about it because you can't reverse this long secular trend of these positive and negative feedback loops happening at the same time by like cutting somebody's taxes or cutting social spending. It doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Because that's their entire social policy toolkit. Mm-hmm. So they don't even want to notice it because they don't have any idea what to do about it. But it's going to kill them if they don't start doing anything about it. But that slide aside. So with respect to the incentive to urbanize from having a higher level of education, it's really significant that openness, again, is the personality trait that most predicts your desire to get more education. It's basically correlated with curiosity, and a drive to just know stuff. It's also correlated with like wanting to travel and wanting to interface with cultures that are different than yours, right? So the very low openness people are already less likely to be intrinsically motivated to get an education. They're the least likely to want to travel at all. And I think a lot of people really underestimate, as a guy from Iowa who went to, a state school in a rural state, I think a lot of people underestimate the extent to which moving 2 hours away from the family farm to this weird college town, how much of a mind-blowing exotic journey that is for a lot of rural kids. So Iowa City, Iowa doesn't seem like the most cosmopolitan place in the world to, somebody from from Princeton, New Jersey, but
hey, listen, I would submit that I actually wound up as an undergraduate at Princeton, but I would submit that I crossed at least as big a cultural gulf in going there as you didn't going to Iowa City. But we can have that argument later.
Oh, I didn't go to Iowa City. I went to the University of Northern Iowa, which is the most rural-friendly state university in Iowa. Third best state university in Iowa. I'm very proud of it. But like, that is a trip. That is migration, right? Like going from the family farm to the college town and then you see there is a small literature on personality correlates of migration. And again, you see this correlation between openness in migration, between being low openness and being kind of a rooted, just like a more rooted person. And so part of your point, this gets to part of your point, which is red state, blue state kind of mischaracterizes the issue. It's like within a so-called red state, when you go from a rural area to a metropolis, you're going a huge distance in terms of partisan allegiance and you're saying along some other dimensions as well. Yeah, there's not like red state, blue state is utterly confused. People should just stop thinking about it because it only matters in terms of, if you want to think about state legislators or who the senator is or whatever. But it confuses people about the composition of the population. To say that a state is a red state just means that it has a larger population on the less dense side of the density divide than on the more dense side of the density divide. But it doesn't matter where you go, that more dense is more democratic. So my hometown, Marshalltown, Iowa, if you go right in the middle of town, by City Hall, by the county courthouse, that precinct went for Hillary, 70 to 30, or something like that. And as population density in Marshalltown, because it's a town of 27,000 people, but any town like that is well within the denser side of the density divide. It's going to be around 1,000 some people per square mile. But it just fades out so that Trump won Marshall County, but didn't win its biggest city, right? So it's this fractal thing where if you look on the map, and Rodden has great visualizations. If you look at the towns, it's just these little pockets of blue that fade into purple and then to this red countryside, and it's everywhere. It's like every town is blue. Yeah,
last year I walked from St. Louis, Missouri to Columbia, Missouri, with my daughter because she was walking across the whole country. This took like a week. But I remember being in St. Louis and we were in some coffee shop and I just said to her, if you just plunk me down here and asked me where I was, I'd say, I don't know, New York, but then you get 40 miles, out of St. Louis and I just remember thinking, now I understand why they feel that when they turn on the TV and look at this entertainment that's produced in New York or Hollywood and the cable talk stuff on most of the channels, they just feel like it might as well be from another planet. They just don't feel these people are speaking to them or about the world that they live in. It's and you haven't traveled that far, No,
you haven't. One of my favorite pieces that I ever wrote. It's actually, I think in some ways one of the most successful pieces that I wrote is this blog post that I knocked out years ago. It's on the personality psychology stuff for Big Think. I don't know if you know that website.
Yep.
And it's on country music and low openness and how because the same guy that I was talking about before, Jason Renfro, he's done some interesting music on musical tastes and its correlates with personality type. And it turns out that there is a conservative musical genre, that low openness people like music that has a certain kind of sonic and rhythmic profile, and the kind of music that you can buy that fits that profile is country music. And the messages of country music are messages that are very specifically directed to lower openness people. It's about continuity of the same way of life through generations. There's so many songs about like I was once a boy who had a mother, and now I'm a I'm a boy who had a dad, and now I'm a dad who has a boy. They love those symmetries. Or I used to be the kid that the guy that the dad aimed the shotgun at when you came over to date his daughter, and now I'm doing the same thing to the boys coming. And there's just all of these, lots of songs about how I've been all over the world, but ain't nothing better than the willow tree by the creek, down here in Alabama, right? Like there were just kind of so there are like all these little sort of subgenres of country music, and they're all like these certain kinds of really consoling low openness messages. And I was like, one of the points I was making in that piece is that like that music, it's not like, it's like not culture war at all. There's every now and then some stupid culture war song, but it's like, if you're thinking about culture war, it's like a bunker that gives you insulates you from.
It's not explicitly anti-cosmopolitan or anti-modern, but it's home sweet home.
Yeah, what it's telling you is validating that the kind of life that you have in the country among people like you who want to live a life that's a lot like the life that your parents and grandparents live, that you are in fact living the most meaningful and satisfying life, and that you shouldn't have any regrets about not doing something else, because this really is the best it gets. I mean, that really is basically the earth theme of country music as a genre, and implicitly there's a criticism of urban cosmopolitanism, but usually it doesn't come in explicitly.
So, there's a couple of ways we could go. Now, for one thing, you, like in the Times piece even, which isn't, it's just kind of op-ed linked, but even there, you did go into some of your ideas about how to reform the system to restore some sort of proportionality of influence on the electoral system, so that low density areas are not overrepresented on a per person basis. Before we should touch on that briefly, because for one thing, your idea is different from the standard ideas. But before we get to that, what about the larger problem of the gulf we're describing? The fact of the gulf, in the cultural gulf between low density areas and high density areas, because you can fix the system in a way that people like Trump start losing the elections 52-48 instead of winning them 52-48, but in the end, it's still a problem if you've got a gulf, a cultural gulf kind of this magnitude, right? Yeah,
it's really hard, right? Like in part of my account of kind of populist feelings is that you get that self-selection effect. And so that basically the most dispositionally conservative people end up in the lower density areas because everybody else is kind of selected out. But then the reason other people are selecting out is partly because economic production and wealth is concentrating in cities. And so where you are is declining in relative terms. And that makes you angry. You feel like you're already worried about your loss of cultural status and centrality as the country changes demographically. And that's something that you see when you turn on the TV and it kind of bugs you. But also, you are year after year of falling further and further behind the sort of like median standard of living in the country. And it feels like that must be somebody's fault. Because like the low openness personality is kind of like least attracted to sort of like dynamism, tends not to, this is, great. I've got it right here, this book, The Politics of Resentment by Catherine Kramer. It's about kind of state politics in Wisconsin. She does a lot of like ethnography and talks to farmers and, Scott Walker supporters. And you see over and over again this sense from rural people just like a sense of bafflement about why it is that somebody who sits at a computer terminal in Madison gets paid 5 times what they do when they get up at 4 a.m. And break their back all day, feeding the hogs and driving the tractor and stuff like that. Like it's not intuitive why, the information economy work actually does create more wealth per unit of work. And so it seems like there's some sort of kind of grift going on where like the people in the city are stealing the wealth and you should be getting a bigger share and you don't know why. And somebody comes along and tells you that, well, I'll tell you what it is. It's like, cosmopolitan urban elites just like, screwing you over with like trade policy, and they let all the freaking immigrants in who are taking the jobs, right? Like, and the immigrants thing is always baffling because the immigrants are never taking the jobs where people are most.
Well, I think there are cases. I brought this up with. I wish I could remember the.
But those people are already most disposed to have strongly anti-immigration views.
Yeah, but I mean, there are cases where, like the local meat packing plant, or there are cases like in the Midwest where in rural areas, you can point to places where absolutely immigrants have jobs and so on. It does happen.
Yeah,
but all of this is Mexican. All of this is intensified by, the fact that politicians have realized that they can play the kind of resentment card, the kind of these cultural elites hold you in contempt, which, to be honest, isn't entirely inaccurate. There are people, affluent people on the East Coast, who hold these people in low regard, and or more commonly, just kind of don't think about them at all, or barely aware they're there. So it's not entirely off message, but I mean, a number of Republican politicians have made a big going all the way back to Dan Quayle.
There is a ton of cosmopolitan urban condescension, and that's just like the other side of the cultural divide. People just don't get it, right? Like I in my super liberal college town, I hear like very urbane college professors, talk about how threatened they feel if they know somebody in a truck is a Trump voter or something like that. And that's just, for me, that's just kind of ignorance. One, I'm comfortable with rural people having grown up in a rural state, but also, looking at the kind of stuff I'm looking at, the psychological correlates of people's sort of political dispositions, it actually makes it has made me way less judgmental. Right, like it's actually made me less judgmental of highly ethnocentric people. Right, like I understand that people with a certain kind of personality profile is likely to have relatively restrictive views about immigration, which I intensely disagree with. But the best evidence suggests that that's pretty deeply built into them. There's not a lot that changes those views over time. And so you start to see the diversity of psychological types that conform to the ideological range as just a constraint on the way things are going to work, right? Like you're going to have, there's no getting rid of people with socially conservative dispositions. There's just and it is a bit of sort of progressive naivete that you think that if you had the right course of re-education or something that you bring people around. It's but it's not how it works. Like personality is really pretty heritable, and it gets passed along and doesn't change that much over the course of people's lives. And so you just have to be like, no, so the interesting questions are structural questions. Like, how do you design your institutions to make sure that those kind of divisions aren't going to lead to kind of social conflict, because you're not getting rid of these differences. You just need to but democracy is always about managing disagreement. And so you have to figure out the way to design the institutions in a way that's not going to exacerbate these divisions, but will tend to sort of diffuse them a little bit. But it just turns out that the way our electoral system is designed it's like how you would design it if you were trying to figure out a way to cleave these groups of Americans apart. Like, you can't blame James Madison for not like seeing mass urbanization coming, but like our Constitution just isn't designed for the world we've got.
Because people in low density areas are disproportionately represented. Is that the main problem?
It's the main problem, but it's not the only problem. I mean, so there's all sorts of like low density bonuses, right? There's a minimum of one representative. So it doesn't matter.
The population wouldn't be above the threshold for that.
Yeah, so
and a minimum of 2 electoral votes, even if your population wouldn't warrant that, right? Or is it 3? It's
3. It's 3 electoral votes, and obviously you're going to get 2 senators, no matter what.
Yeah, that seems to me the wildest, That is
the wildest. But it's not just those things either. It also is the sort of discretionary, not constitutionally mandated way that we do House districts, because like it turns out that the way you gerrymander is packing and cracking, and you try to pack a bunch of you try to pack all of the other side into as few districts as possible, and then kind of separate and basically cities are pre-packed, right? And so even fairly drawn electoral districts give a slight advantage to the lower density party. So which is one reason why it might be good to get away from having legislative districts. Because you don't have to. You could just have, Iowa's got 4 House districts, which are pretty fairly drawn because we have a commission that does it. But like, there's no reason that it's not mandated. We could just have 4 at-large representatives, the whole state.
Okay. So anyway, you have your proposals about this. We don't have time to get into them really in depth, but one could, in principle, address the problem. There's 2 things there's one thing I don't understand, and then I want to return to this question of to what extent you'd really solve the problem of these structural reforms. The first thing I don't understand is so ultimately the reason the House also embodies an overrepresentation of low density areas, ultimately that has to do with the fact that most states are controlled by Republican state legislatures, which do the redistricting and hence the gerrymandering. Is that it?
So it's a little complicated. So because of population density and the way that does compress the Democratic voters into a smaller area, as I said, like a fairly drawn district still tends to give a little bit of a bonus to the lower density party. So democratically controlled states do have opportunistic gerrymanders, but those gerrymanders tend to mostly just offset the disadvantage that they suffer because of population density. But when Republicans do gerrymandering... I see what you're saying.
So now I see what you mean by cities naturally pack. It's almost like if you were a Republican, you would want there to be cities because then the kind of gerrymandering you want to do just happens naturally.
Yeah, so you get crazy things like in Texas where, Austin is a famously liberal town, but it's got like 6 congressional districts that take a piece of it, and like one of them has like a Democrat in it, right? Like they can just you can just pick it apart. And so if you have a Republican-controlled state legislature in a state that has big cities, you can create a crazy gerrymander that gives you a nutso advantage at the state legislative and at the House level. Whereas Democrats couldn't really ever do anything that could mirror that because of the way they're already so densely.
Okay, so then back to this, and we should probably close on this reflection. But the question of, okay, so suppose you do the reform, Trump loses 52-48 next time around or whatever. And, various policies are different. You talk in your New York Times speech, you talk about immigration and how, basically the reason 100,000 Latinos are rounded up in Los Angeles is because of voters who are nowhere near Los Angeles, right? And you get into that, who are in low density area, the people who put Trump in office and so on. So granted, you could do that, but it seems to me, so then Trump loses and so on, but then you're kind of back to where we were before, which is with these people feeling neglected, people in low density areas feeling neglected, not represented, culturally alienated. And that's what got us into, part of what got us into the mess we're in, if you agree with me that having Trump as president is a mess. Or maybe another way to put it is like, okay, so suppose, next time the Trump candidate only gets 48% of the vote. I mean, if you had told me 30 years ago, if you had described Donald Trump and the set of policies he supports and said, someday there will be a candidate who gets 48% of the vote, but will lose, I would have said, well, we still got a problem, even though the candidate lost, right? Does this make sense?
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. Like, so I think one thing that people don't get, especially like when I explain it to some people, like this kind of like sorting explanation for polarization seems like really fatalistic. But like my real point is like the effect that it has really depends on how that happens to line up with the very particular structure of institutions that you have. I think we actually just hit like a set of perfect storm conditions with Trump, and I'm actually way more optimistic than maybe you'd think, because the like it's very, very difficult to, so we because of all the low density bonus and stuff like that, like, everybody knows about the famous 2012, Republican postmortem that said that they'd have to make inroads in non-white constituencies in order to keep holding on to power. Well, that turns out not to be true if you can still keep picking up more and more rural white vote share, which is what Trump did. But but in that one race at this one point in time with this kind of perfect storm of electoral conditions, he's basically maxed out that coalition. Mm-hmm. And if you want to keep winning with it, there's no way to keep winning without massive voter disenfranchisement, which is one of the reasons why Republicans in states that are, in population terms, like Georgia, that are on the cusp of flipping, are very actively trying to disenfranchise voters. But they're doing it precisely because it is going to be impossible to continue winning with that coalition, even with the low density bonus. As soon as that becomes impossible, Republicans have to recalibrate. And you're going to get party realignment, right? So like right now where the density divide is between the inner suburbs and the outer suburbs, and it moved out a little in the midterms, right? Republicans are going to have to push it in. They're going to have to get a larger vote share in the inner suburbs, which is a more diverse, more educated group of people, to hold on to power at all. That changes the constitution of that party. It means that they can't cater entirely to the rural.
Right, but that doesn't solve my concern that we could be moving toward a world where those people just feel completely unrepresented. I mean, somebody needs to represent. They need to feel represented. Now,
they will still be by far and away the most overrepresented people in our political system. Losing relative ground is bitter for people. Like there's not really a salve for it. So if you're used to dominance and you've just, you've dropped to plurality or something like that, like it still feels like a tragedy and you're going to be mad about it. But like the problem isn't that rural whites in economically struggling places are underrepresented because they're overrepresented. It's that they are not demanding representation that actually addresses their problems. And I think a lot of those voters will flip Democratic if
They're
Democrats
not truly voting their economic interests. You mean?
Yeah. I think there's a strong case to be made that they pretty rationally voted their economic interest in the last election. That Trump gave a compelling narrative about decline that he based in trade and immigration and promised to reverse. I don't think you can't expect people to have true beliefs about the way economies work. So I think people thought they were voting in their economic self-interest, but the trade war is screwing over farmers and manufacturers and manufacturing workers. Like the immigration crackdown doesn't help anybody, and it hurts a lot. Like it hurts employers in like my state who need immigrants to do agricultural manufacturing, like meat packing. Mm-hmm. And so like the actual policies are hurting more, and they see that. Plus, every single Republican in the congressional delegation voted multiple times to take away health benefits from a group of people.
That's what I was thinking about when I was talking about voting their economic. The "What's the matter with Kansas" thesis that if that really in a lot of ways Democrats would better represent their economic interests. But
but I think I think that has to become pretty visceral. You have to really feel it. But like after, like it's undeniable that so if you're in the position where you got laid off from a small manufacturing place because the cost of your inputs went up because of the trade war, mm-hmm. but your daughter has leukemia and you've just lost your work insurance, and that counts as a pre-existing condition, right? Like trying to get rid of coverage for pre-existing conditions really means your daughter might die, right? And that kind of threat is way more immediate and motivating to people than abstract identity threat, right? Like you can't ever trump this really immediate sense of economic precariousness. Yeah. Trump tried by ginning up a fake thing with the caravan to try to create some sense of physical threat out of what is really just trying to cater off of an identity threat. But it just didn't work. He lost more rural vote share than he lost suburban and urban vote share. And it's because of the healthcare stuff. And if Republicans just keep ignoring it, like some Democrat will come along and drink their milkshake, because it's way easier for Democrats already have to message to multiple different sort of ethnic and cultural constituencies. It's super easy for a Democrat to reach out to rural white voters, and it's really hard for Republicans to reach into suburban and urban, educated, non-white voters. So like I think they're really in trouble. Because there's a sense of complacency that rural white voters are just completely locked down by culture war stuff, abortion, guns, immigration. But they're not if their standard of living keeps going down and people that they love are dying from a lack of health insurance. So I think they're on the cusp of total catastrophic disaster, which is exactly what I want to happen, because that's what forces the Republican Party to become a party that is more inclusive and takes the interests of a broader group of people seriously.
So the contradictions are heightening in your view. The revolution will come. So, well, thank you. I think I'm going to close with a little self-promotion. What led to the Twitter exchange between you and me that led to this subject is a piece I wrote in Wired that we'll link to, which is has a different kind of take on Trumpism and is a more global, cosmic set of ideas about.
I'm sorry I talked the whole time. I wanted to talk about your piece.
No, that wasn't my aim. But I encourage people to read it, and we'll link to it. I mean, we didn't. If we had more time, and maybe we could do this next time, we could talk about one thing that is involved in the differences of perspective between that piece and your take, which is like, what are the relative importance of things like economic globalization, immigration, even automation, in terms of the sense of peril that is felt kind of in the heartland or whatever. That's a whole subject made for another conversation.
I think there's a complementary explanation.
Yeah, I think all three of those have some effect. And I think the tendency is to underestimate automation and overestimate immigration, but they all three have some impact. So anyway, where do you tweet? Remind us, is it just Will Wilkinson?
At Will Wilkinson, yeah.
At Will Wilkinson. I'm Robert Writer, Wrighter. And where else can people go to? You've done a number of New York Times pieces that people can Google.
I'm a contributing opinion writer at the Times, so I got a little page where you can find some of my pieces there. I write periodically for Vox, so there's a bunch of pieces there.
Okay. Well, then get back to doing the magnum opus on this very subject.
I will. It was great talking to you, man.
Same here, Will. See you around.
Yeah.